we're just sort of reminding you again of the joint targeting principles, and what Charlie and I are going to talk a little bit about is also how protection is so important throughout the whole targeting process. And you can see that the joint targeting principles are really reflecting this, from sort of the overall objective of protection focus to a participatory approach, working with the community, to the inclusiveness of the targeting process, not leaving someone behind who is extremely vulnerable, for example, but also throughout the whole process, all the way to monitoring, where I think protection monitoring is a very key component. So we can go to the next slide, Emmanuel, please. We just want to emphasize that often in operations, when we do targeting processes, protection or AAP experts or field officers, people working with communities, are not always sort of fully engaged in the process. And I think it is really important, from sort of a protection risk assessment that we often should do before going into the targeting process, but looking at sort of perspectives that the assessment may not pick up. Looking at, for example, the social cohesion in families, problems with documentation, discrimination. I mean, protection is there to do everything to not exclude the most vulnerable in this process. And if they are part of this process, they can really influence the targeting approach. So I think in your operations, always engage protection, AAP, community-based protection, and the people working on the ground with the communities. Of course, protection is also very important from a data protection point of view. There's a lot of assessments and data analysis and data sharing, so it's also important to adhere to the data protection policies and frameworks that WFP and UNHCR have in place. Another aspect, I think, which sometimes are left outside of the sort of socioeconomic assessment and the targeting approach, is looking at it from a rights-based approach. So, for example, for refugees, which is a target group also of the joint hub, they often have limited rights. So let's say that they cannot move, they don't have freedom of movement, they have restricted rights in terms of work, they don't have the right to work, they may not access financial services, etc. Of course, that will influence the way that they can gain income, their well-being and their engagement, both socially and economically in a society. So I think those are the kind of perspectives also that are important to consider throughout the targeting process. Of course, the protection monitoring and the monitoring of the implementation of the targeting approach, reflecting on the protection perspectives, the exclusion, for example. These kind of things are also important to look from a protection lens. One thing that we have seen sometimes is that status is included as a targeting consideration. This can, of course, exclude people. It's not something that we would recommend. It can exclude asylum seekers, extremely vulnerable groups. This has to really be sort of from an overall protection perspective of who is in the most need. Another thing that is, of course, important is that often in protection work, we have case management. And it is really important that there is a strong and solid and fully functioning referral system in place, so that we can refer the most vulnerable, so that they are also ensured to get assistance throughout the process. But maybe I will hand over now to Charlie, who will talk a little bit about complaints and feedback mechanisms, the participatory approach, working with communities, which is all core throughout the targeting process. So Charlie, over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Annika, and thanks for having me this morning. Yeah, so in 2017, both WFP and UNHCR reaffirmed its commitments to the interagency standing agencies' commitments on accountability to affected populations. And WFP and UNHCR have since developed tools to help them deliver on these commitments, with UNHCR recently launching its operational guidance on AAP. WFP is currently in the process of updating its AAP strategy following the recent endorsements of the protection and accountability policy. And what we know is that by working with communities to understand the context and the community dynamics and structures, whether that be through a protection analysis, a context analysis, you'll better understand who you are engaging with and who you're not engaging with, and therefore who is at risk of being excluded. An engagement in the targeting process therefore helps to ensure transparency, accountability, and crucially acceptance of the targeting exercise by the community. And this in turn will help mitigate the risk of tension and mistrust resulting from the targeting process. And we know that true participation can be achieved through engagement as well as through accurate data collection and dissemination. And so what does this mean for the targeting process? Well, we can say that we've achieved participation in targeting once the most at-risk members of a community have claimed they have influenced decision-making linked to the targeting. They can say that they've been equipped to claim their rights through the process. They've been equipped to measure the adequacy of the targeting process and being equipped to make informed decisions regarding the targeting exercise. And so when we talk about vulnerability, who are we talking about? I mean, of course, there are multiple layers of vulnerability. There's multiple layers of risk and exposure to that risk. And I like to think when looking at community engagement, I often like to think, OK, will an older woman who has a disability, is illiterate, is not comfortable using a mobile phone, and is a minority language speaker, will she be able to receive and understand the messaging around targeting? Is she aware of how to provide feedback and complaints? Can she even access a CFM if its primary feedback channel is a hotline, for example? And so when you bear that in mind, you start to understand what your target profile will be. If you design your targeting criteria with them, if you engage with local trusted actors, for example, with organizations for persons with disability, and if you disaggregate data by gender, age, and disability, you'll have a much better understanding of the drivers of vulnerability and also the capacities to respond to those risks. And crucially, co-designing targeting criteria will help build community ownership, trust in, and acceptance of the process, and will ensure, as Annika mentioned earlier, that no one has been left behind. And so before the targeting process begins, a community engagement strategy should really be in place, as well as a functional CFM, both of which you should be designing with the community to ensure that people are receiving accurate information through formats and channels that they can access and in formats that they can understand. This means validating with, for example, minority language speakers that they have been able to receive and understand the information that we've been sharing, making sure that a person with disability are communicating their needs or their feedback through a CFM. And we can talk about this topic for a long time, but just to keep it short, what we've noticed in the field with WFP is that the countries that have been able to most successfully demonstrate participation through the targeting exercises are those where there's a strong protection presence and there's a strong collaboration between program protection monitoring to allow people to claim their rights and influence the decision making around targeting. Thank you.